Capitola Black Recordings presents an unabridged recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker, or A Lady of England. Chapter 15. A Cloud of Care. On the following morning, as Edward Manton had just concluded his simple breakfast and was about to quit the lodging to visit an invalid friend, he heard a gentle tap at his sitting-room door, and his landlady entered the apartment. Mr. Manton supposed that Annie had come to receive orders about household arrangements, but a glance at her pale, anxious face, and the disordered attire of one who was remarkable for neatness, made him aware that something painful had occurred. "Anything the matter with your boy?" inquired the missionary kindly.
"Oh, no, sir, not with Nettie. But I'm so very uneasy about my husband. He's always so early, sir, going to his office, but this morning he's not got up at all, and he complains of such terrible pain in his limbs, and altogether he's not like himself at all, sir."
"Would he like me to see him?" asked the clergyman, rising.
"Well, I don't know, sir. I'm half afraid,"
and Annie stood uneasily pulling off and on the yellow serpent which she wore. "Had you not better send for a doctor?"
"Martin can't abide doctors," faltered Annie. "He was so angry just now when I spoke of one, and he is in such a way because he can't get to the city. I'm sure I don't know which side to turn," said the young wife with an anxious sigh.
"Perhaps he would see me as a friend, and if it seemed to me needful that he should have medical advice, I might persuade him to send for a doctor. Remember," added the clergyman, in a cheering tone, "remember the password which I gave you yesterday. Watch, pray, and hope for all."
"I'll tell him you are coming, sir," said Annie.
Mr. Manton followed her at a little distance, and as he set his foot on the highest step of the steep stair, heard an irritable voice call out from the interior of a room, "I'll have nothing to do with parsons. Send for the parson when you send for the undertaker. Both are birds of a feather." The missionary, satisfied that the sick man was in no mood to receive a visit, descended the staircase and re-entered his own sitting-room, where he was soon after joined by Annie.
"Oh, sir, what's to be done about the business? He is in such a worry and fret about it."
"What business do you mean, Mrs. Warren?"
"He's clerk to a manufacturer in the city, sir, and he can't get to his work, and Mr. Barnes will be awful angry, and not know what keeps him away."
"Would you not write?" Poor Annie looked perplexed, and shook her head with a doubtful air.
"I don't think Mr. Barnes would care for a letter," she said.
She might have added to herself that it would have been a terrible task to have written one. "Shall I go and speak to the manufacturer myself?"
"Oh, sir, if you only would, he'd listen to a gentleman like you."
And the anxious face brightened with a gleam of comfort. Edward Manton took up his hat and set off at once for the city. He had no difficulty in finding out Mr. Barnes's office, and was introduced to a smoke-dried, beetle-browed man, whose hard features seemed cut out of wood. "Very ill, did you say?" "I have not myself seen him, but from the report of his wife, he is utterly unfit to attend here to-day, and his involuntary absence from his duty preys upon the poor man's mind." "He'll be here tomorrow, I suppose? Irregular attendance is mighty inconvenient. It's a thing I never put up with." "Unless," said Mr. Manton gravely, "in the event of those casualties to which we are all liable ourselves. I cannot promise you that Warren will be here tomorrow, but he will come if it be possible to do so." "Well, well, we must give him a day or two's law, I suppose, but he must make a short job of his illness, or we must make short work with his place." Mr. Manton returned to his lodging a good deal wearied, for his strength was easily exhausted, as he was in England solely on account of broken health. Necessary business had detained him near London for a week, but he was on the following day to return to his father's home in Surrey, where, in the pleasant seclusion of the country, he might repair his weakened constitution, and prepare for new labours abroad. He found Annie anxiously awaiting his return, with her child as usual in her arms.
My husband's worse,
was her exclamation on seeing the clergyman.
His mind seems wandering. He said such strange things. What shall I do? Oh, what shall I do?
You have, of course, sent for a doctor?
I was afraid, said the poor, weak girl. Martin was so much against it this morning. It might make him angry if he knew it afterwards.
Send Sarah at once for the doctor, said Mr. Manton decidedly. I take all responsibility on myself, and I will be answerable for the fee. He then proceeded himself to the sick man's chamber, and found him in the agonies of rheumatic fever, utterly unable to attend to or even to understand anything which the clergyman might say.
He'll be better tomorrow, sir, won't he?
Cried Annie, who had followed Mr. Manton, and who now stood trembling with anxiety to be confirmed in what was rather a wish than a hope. His recovery will take time. We must be patient, hopeful, added the clergyman. We will hear the report of the doctor. Returning to his own apartment, Mr. Manton wrote 2 letters, one to Mr. Barnes, eloquently pleading that some temporary arrangement might be made to prevent the long illness which was inevitable from utterly ruining the prospects of the clerk. The other letter was to Edward's father, postponing his own departure for Surrey. I could not leave that poor, helpless young creature, thought Manton, so ignorant of the ways of the world, so fearful of any responsibility, to meet this terrible trial unaided. But for the support given to her by the clearer judgment and firmer mind of her lodger, poor Annie would have been utterly crushed under the miseries of the next 6 days. Mr. Manton relieved her of no inconsiderable part of the night and day watch beside the tortured and excitable patient. Annie needed guidance in every difficulty, support at every step. She had indeed enough to wring a heart tender and loving as hers. Mr. Barnes proved inexorable, as it was impossible that Warren, even should he recover, would for months be equal to work. His situation was filled up at once. The small arrears of his salary, calculated to the shilling, were forwarded to his unhappy wife. This sum and the little money derived from the lodging were almost at once swept away by the necessity of defraying some heavy bills, and pecuniary embarrassment was thus added to domestic trouble. Mr. Manton did what he could to alleviate the painful pressure, but his own purse was a light one, and the aid which he could give was but small. At the end of 6 days, Martin Warren was pronounced to be quite out of danger, but it was evident that it must be long, very long, before he could set a foot to the ground. His state of mind was very unsatisfactory. He listened indeed to the man who had helped him in his sorest need, but he listened with evident impatience. Though not yet aware of the extent of his misfortunes, for the fact of his place being lost was kept from him by the doctor's advice, his whole soul was full of fierce rebellion against the decrees of Providence. He could not always be restrained by respect for the clergyman from uttering such sentiments aloud as made Annie tremble and weep. The poor girl's nerves seemed almost shattered by her night-watching, anxiety, and woe. "I wish, Mrs. Warren, that you could procure some assistance," said the clergyman as he met her one morning with a letter in his hand. "I have received news which render it necessary that I should go home early tomorrow. Is there no neighbour who would relieve you at least of the care of your child?"
My child, my blind Nettie! Oh, I could not part with him. He is my only comfort,
cried the young mother, turning on her darling a gaze of intensest love, while Nettie put his little hand caressingly over her face, and played with the locks of the parent whom he never could see.
Even Martin watches him with pleasure as he begins to trot about the room so prettily. Oh, I knew that my husband was better when he began to take notice of his child. Just now I lifted the baby onto the bed to give Martin his morning kiss, and the boy called out "Papa" quite clear, just as if he knew him, poor darling. And his father said, "God bless him." Yes, sir, indeed, I heard Martin say, "God bless him,"
and the eyes of the poor young wife swam with hopeful tears. "But still the nursing is heavy upon you. I should leave this place with a more satisfied mind if I knew that some experienced friend were near to help you."
"Oh, if I had only my mother,"
sighed Annie. "Would she not come to you in your need?"
"She would come, I am sure she would come. But Martin's so bitter against her. He dislikes her particular ways. I dare not mention such a thing to my husband."
"Shall I speak to him on the subject?" said the clergyman, who felt how valuable, how almost necessary to Annie, would be a mother's counsels and support. Manton had lately accidentally discovered that Annie was the daughter of a parishioner of his own father, and what he knew of the character of Mrs. Laver made him the more anxious to reunite her to her child. The poor girl's face brightened at the proposal.
"Please, sir, do so. You know so well how to speak a word just at the minute when he will bear it. But not now," she added quickly. "Not till he has had his forenoon sleep. He always wakes up more quiet."
"When I come in from my walk, I will talk to him," said Mr. Manton. As Annie returned to the sick room of Warren, he received her with the question, "Annie, have you heard nothing from Mr. Barnes?" She started at the abruptness of his manner, looking perplexed and unable to reply. "Of course you sent word to him that I was ill, to account for my absence from the office." The tone was sharper than before.
"Well, I think, Mr. Manton—"
"Answer me straightforwardly and at once, and don't stand stammering like a fool. Does he know that I am ill, yes or no?"
"Yes,"
replied Annie timidly. "And will he keep my situation for me, yes or no?"
"No,"
faltered the trembling wife. Warren would have started up in his bed, but his limbs were powerless from the effects of his illness. His voice, however, seemed to have lost none of its strength, as he exclaimed, "You don't mean to say that he has filled up my place?" Annie's tearful silence was sufficient reply. Warren's loud, angry accents had startled his blind child, and the little one began to cry. "Take away that whining brat!" cried the father fiercely. But as Annie was about to reply and carry Nettie out of the room, she was roughly called back by her husband. "Was nothing done, nothing attempted, to save me from this ruin?" asked the miserable man.
"Oh, yes," said Annie eagerly. "Mr. Manton went 2 or 3 times to the city on purpose, but—"
"Mr. Manton is a humbug!" exclaimed Warren, quite carried away by his passion. "I dare say he's been denouncing me to my employer as an infidel because I won't be led blindfolded like himself. You must go yourself, and at once."
"Oh, Martin!" exclaimed Annie with an appealing look of distress. "I never should know what to say. I never was clever as you are."
"Cleverness! The woman is out of her senses. I married an idiot indeed if I married a girl who could not speak a word for her husband."
"Shall I just wait until Mr. Manton comes home?"
"Wait! You have waited much too long already. Put on your bonnet at once, and don't take the heavy boy with you, as if you could not cross a street without having him clinging to your neck." Annie had no choice but to obey. She dressed hastily for a walk, her fingers trembling so as to render it difficult to fasten the strings of her bonnet. She then carried Nettie downstairs, and calling her servant girl Sarah, gave over the child to her care.
"Mind you watch him closely, very closely. Remember, poor lamb, that he is blind, and he is getting so active on his feet that he needs more looking after than ever. And see that master does not want his beef tea, and that the fire does not go out in his room. Oh, Sarah, remember what a charge I leave to you until I come back to them again." The girl looked sullen and cross. She had not been engaged, she muttered, to look after a child. And as for entering the room where the sick man lay like a chained bear, ready to snarl and snap at whoever approached him, no one would willingly do that. Thank you for listening to Capitola Black Recordings. I hope you have enjoyed this recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker.